I mean, I want you to picture something you almost certainly did this morning. You walked into your kitchen or, maybe the bathroom, and you reached out and turned the handle on the sink.
Right, just a completely automatic thing.
Exactly. You watched the water flow out. It was clear and cold, and you filled a glass, brought it to your lips, and drank it. It is literally the most mindless, routine, invisible action of your entire day.
Yeah, you did it without a single second thought.
But if you take that exact same action filling a glass of water from a municipal tap and move it back just over a century ago, I mean, you are no longer just hydrating yourself. You are basically playing a game of biological Russian roulette.
You really were. It was a daily gamble, and the stakes were incredibly high because the modern livable city as we know it today, it just did not exist back then.
Right.
The infrastructure to support dense human populations, it simply hadn't caught up with the reality of where all those people were living.
Yeah, American cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were expanding at this explosive, unprecedented rate, and they were paying a really devastating price for all that rapid growth.
And the currency they were paying with was human lives.
Wow.
Specifically, lives lost to typhoid fever.
Yeah, typhoid, which is a word that sounds almost, I don't know, quaint to us today, like a plot device in a Victorian novel where a character just sort of faints on a chaise lounge.
Right, it feels very removed from our modern reality.
But the reality of the bacterium behind it, which is salmonella typhi, is anything but quaint. So for this deep dive, we really need to look closely at what this organism actually does to the human body.
Because understanding the villain here is crucial to understanding the sheer panic it caused back then. And, the panic was entirely justified.
So how does it actually work? Like, how did people catch it?
Well, salmonella typhi is transmitted through the fecal-oral route.
Ew.
I know it's a clinical term, but we really have to be stark about what that actually means in practice.
All right, let's just lay it out for everyone.
It means that the bacteria shed in the human waste of an infected person literally find their way into the municipal water supply or, the food supply, and then they are subsequently swallowed by the very next victim.
It's just a horrific cycle to even think about.
And once you ingest them, these bacteria don't just stay in your stomach. They actually invade the lining of the small intestine, and then they hitch a ride inside your white blood cells.
Wait, really? Inside the white blood cell?
Yes. The very immune cells that are meant to destroy them. They use them to travel to the liver, the spleen, and the bone marrow.
So they basically turn the body's own defense system into a Trojan horse. That is terrifying.
It is. And the symptoms that follow are just brutal. We are talking about weeks of a sustained baking fever, profound physical weakness, abdominal pain.
And it gets worse than that, right?
Much worse.
Yeah.
In severe cases, you'd see delirium or even intestinal hemorrhaging. And because municipal water systems of this era were often drawing directly from rivers or lakes where upstream cities were just, dumping untreated sewage.
Right. The water you served your family at the dinner table could be laced with the exact pathogen that would kill them a month later.
Exactly. It was a completely ubiquitous shadow over urban life. To give you a sense of the scale, in the late 1800s, it wasn't uncommon for major American cities to see typhoid death rates of 50 to 100 people per 100,000 residents every single year.
That is just a staggering number of people dying from drinking water.
Yeah. And it was largely accepted as just the tragic, unavoidable cost of doing business in a big metropolis.
But science wasn't totally in the dark, right? They knew what was causing it by then.
They did, yeah. German bacteriology had successfully identified the salmonella typhi germ under a microscope by the 1880s, which, was a massive scientific leap.
Right, but seeing the killer through a microscope lens didn't actually stop it from flowing out of the tap into someone's kitchen?
Precisely. Identifying the problem doesn't automatically fix the plumbing.
Right. I like to think of it like this. It's like a massive ship taking on water. The contamination of the municipal water supply was a giant structural failure. A huge hole in the hull.
That's a great analogy.
But instead of focusing all their energy and, all their capital on patching that massive hole, public health authorities initially became absolutely obsessed with a completely different strategy.
They did.
They decided to try bailing out the ocean with a teaspoon. I mean, they focused this incredibly intense, coercive power on controlling individual people rather than engineering a safer environment.
And that misplaced focus created one of the most profound civil liberties crises in American medical history.
It really did.
To understand how the public and the legal system fundamentally misunderstood the nature of this threat, We have to look at the human drama that permanently redefined who could be considered dangerous.
Yes. We have to talk about the summer of 1907. This is the start of our deep dive into the human side of this.
And it begins with a medical detective hunt that honestly reads like a thriller.
It really does. So there's this sanitary engineer named George Soper, and he gets hired to investigate a very alarming anomaly.
Right, and it's important to note that S.O.H. Prabor wasn't a medical doctor treating patients in a hospital ward. His expertise was tracing the environmental pathways of disease.
Like tracking how it moved through the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's called in because typhoid, which was usually a disease that ravaged crowded, impoverished tenement districts due to poor sanitation, is suddenly striking affluent, wealthy households.
Right, in places like Oyster Bay, Long Island, places with perfect plumbing.
The Oyster Bay outbreak was the catalyst. Because if you have an outbreak in a wealthy household with immaculate indoor plumbing, pristine living spaces, and absolutely no connection to contaminated municipal water.
Then the water isn't the problem.
Right. It signals that the pathogen is being carried across the threshold by a human vector.
So SOH approaches this with incredible, shoe leather epidemiology. He doesn't just look at the pipes. He looks at the employment records of these wealthy families.
Which was a brilliant move.
He cross-references the timelines of outbreaks across multiple wealthy estates over several years, and he finds this single invisible thread connecting them all.
A common denominator.
Exactly. And that denominator was a freelance itinerant cook who moved from kitchen to kitchen just weeks before each family fell violently ill.
An Irish immigrant named Mary Mallon.
Mary Mallon. And when S.O.H. finally tracks her down, he expects to find someone who is, recovering from a severe illness, or maybe someone who is just chronically unwell.
Right, because that was the medical understanding of the time.
Yeah.
You had to be sick to spread sickness.
But instead, he is confronted with a woman who completely shatters the existing medical paradigm. Mary Mallon is robust, she is strong, and she is working full-time.
She represented a concept that the scientific community was really only just beginning to theorize, and that the general public found utterly absurd.
The healthy carrier.
Yes, the healthy carrier.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because I really want to understand the biological mechanics here. It explains this entire tragedy.
It does. So Mary M. Mallon was the very first documented person in North America whose body had reached this bizarre truce with Salmonella Typhi.
A truce?
Yeah, the bacteria colonized her gallbladder. So she was actively shedding millions of virulent typhoid germs in her waste. But her immune system kept her from experiencing a single symptom herself.
So she wasn't feverish, she wasn't bedridden. To her own eyes, and literally the eyes of anyone looking at her, she was the absolute picture of health.
Which made S.O.H.'s accusation completely incomprehensible to her. I mean, imagine the scene. S.O.H. confronts Mary in the kitchen of a brownstone in Manhattan.
Right.
He accuses her of leaving a trail of disease and death in her wake, and then demands she hand over samples of her blood, urine, and feces.
And from Mary's perspective, this strange man is just an absolute lunatic. If she felt totally healthy, how could they possibly convince her she was a walking biohazard? Isn't it entirely rational that she would be indignant and defensive?
Oh, it was a completely rational response to what sounded like an irrational accusation.
Because, the germ theory of disease was scientifically accepted by experts, but the public understanding was still heavily tied to visible sickness.
Yeah, exactly. You knew to avoid someone with smallpox because of the visible lesions.
Right.
You avoided someone with tuberculosis because of the bloody cough. The idea that invisible demons were living inside a perfectly healthy woman and then jumping into the food she cooked.
It violated every piece of common sense she possessed. She reacted with sheer, unadulterated outrage. The historical record actually notes she grabbed a carving fork and chased S.O.H. right out of the kitchen.
She did. But her hostility, while totally understandable from her point of view, it escalated the situation. It went from an epidemiological investigation into a violent state intervention.
Because S.O.H. couldn't compel her on his own.
Right, so he brought the full weight of the New York City Department of Health down on her. They dispatched Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker, who was a pioneering public health official, and she was accompanied by police officers.
The physical apprehension of Mary M. Mallon is just harrowing to read about. Dr. Baker later wrote about it, describing how Mary fought like a caged animal.
She eluded them initially, too. She hid in an outhouse for hours.
Yeah, but when they finally cornered her, she kicked, she screamed, she fought so fiercely that Dr. Baker literally had to sit on her chest in the back of the ambulance all the way to the hospital.
It's a shocking image.
Just put yourself in Mary's mind for a second. You feel fine. You know you haven't done anything wrong. And the state sends armed police and doctors to physically abduct you because of a microscopic condition you cannot even feel.
It is the absolute zenith of the state, exercising its police power in the name of public health. And it immediately thrusts us into a massive legal and moral quagmire.
Because what do you do with her now?
Right. Once the state apprehended her, they confirmed through laboratory testing that her stool was indeed teeming with typhoid bacteria. So they decided to exile her.
They sent her to an isolation cottage on North Brother Island, which was this quarantine facility in the East River used for communicable diseases.
And this first detention lasts from 1907 to 1910.
And this is where we really have to peel back the caricature of Typhoid Mary, because that nickname became a massive media sensation, but it was essentially a slur that completely erased her humanity.
The press had a field day with it. The newspapers drew cartoons of her tossing little skulls into frying pans. They framed her as this malicious, intentional poisoner.
But when you bypass that yellow journalism and actually read Mary's own letters from quarantine, the reality is just heartbreaking.
Her correspondence from North Brother Island is essential historical evidence. She doesn't write like a supervillain.
Not at all.
She writes like a profoundly isolated, terrified citizen whose rights have been stripped away without any due process whatsoever.
She wrote this one letter to her lawyer, and she said, "I have been, in fact, a peep show for everybody. I never had typhoid in my life and have always been healthy. Why should I be banished like a leper and compelled to live in solitary confinement with only a dog for a companion?"
It's so powerful.
She wasn't just complaining either. She actively used the legal system. She initiated a habeas corpus lawsuit. She demanded that the New York Supreme Court force the health department to actually justify her indefinite imprisonment when she hadn't committed a crime.
And that habeas corpus hearing of 1909 is a major landmark moment in legal history. It directly pitted the ancient legal right of individual liberty against the cutting-edge science of bacteriology.
The judge really had to weigh her visible, undeniable physical health against the invisible, laboratory-proven threat she supposedly posed to the community.
And the judge ultimately sides with the laboratory. The court ruled that the state's mandate to protect the public from an epidemic outweighed her individual liberty.
Which is a heavy precedent. But we should also talk about the mechanics of how she was actually infecting people, because it plays directly into her own disbelief.
Yes, the court couldn't fathom how she could be so dangerous if she's just cooking normal meals.
Right, because heat kills the bacteria. And it came down to, of all things, her signature dessert, peach ice cream.
The peach ice cream is such a vital epidemiological detail. Cooking food generally kills Salmo and the TFIFI. If Mary was making a hot stew or baking a roast in the oven, the heat would neutralize the bacteria she might have transferred from her unwashed hands.
But peach ice cream is served completely raw and cold.
Exactly. The dairy fat in the cream acted as an insulating blanket for the germs, and the cold temperatures preserved the bacteria perfectly.
So she would slice raw peaches with these contaminated hands, mix them into the cream, and essentially serve her wealthy employers a highly concentrated, chilled culture of typhoid bacteria.
The mechanism was perfect for transmission.
But completely invisible to her.
Entirely invisible. Eventually, though, the public health department realized that the optics of keeping a totally healthy woman locked up indefinitely without a trial were just terrible.
Yeah, it was becoming a PR nightmare.
So in 1910, a new health commissioner came in and offered her a compromise. She would be released from North Brother Island on one very strict condition.
She had to sign an affidavit swearing she would never, ever work as a cook again, and she had to report to the health department regularly.
She signs it, she's released.
And for a few years, she really tries to make it work. She tries to work as a laundress, but the pay is just abysmal compared to the high wages of a private cook for wealthy families.
And this leads to the most catastrophic chapter of her life.
Yeah.
In 1915, there is a sudden, terrifying outbreak of typhoid at the Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan. We are talking about a facility full of vulnerable pregnant women and newborns.
The authorities rush in, they investigate the kitchens, and they find a cook working under the assumed name of Mrs. Brown.
It was Mary Mallon.
She had broken her parole, she changed her name to evade the health department, and she went back to the only profession she really knew.
And the results were incredibly tragic. Roughly 25 people in the hospital were infected, and 2 died.
And whatever sympathy the public still had for her, it vanished overnight. She was no longer seen as this confused victim of overzealous science. The public now viewed her as a willful, deliberate murderer.
The authorities didn't even bother with a hearing this time around. They arrested her, sent her right back to North Brother Island, and basically threw away the key.
She remained in isolation there for the rest of her life, which was approximately 26 more years, until she died of a stroke in 1938.
Her permanent exile really stands as one of the most severe exercises of public health authority in American history. But when we analyze this case with a modern historical perspective, a very uncomfortable truth emerges about how that power was applied.
It's way more than uncomfortable. It's a glaring double standard. I mean, we know wealthier male carriers existed and weren't locked up forever. Was Mary singled out because she was uniquely dangerous or because she was a powerless Irish immigrant the system could easily control?
What's fascinating here is that modern scholarship strongly suggests the latter. She faced the absolute harshest edge of state coercion because of her demographics.
She was a working-class, single Irish immigrant woman.
She had no political power, no wealthy family to advocate for her or pay for ongoing legal battles. And she fit perfectly into existing nativist prejudices of the era that viewed immigrants as inherently diseased.
There was even another guy, right? A male carrier.
Yes, Alphonse Cuttles. He was a bakery and restaurant owner who was also identified as a healthy Typhoid carrier.
And what happened to him?
Well, he promised not to prepare food, just like Mary. He broke that promise, was caught working in his bakery, and his punishment was a suspended sentence. He literally went home.
Wow. He went home. The disparity is just impossible to ignore. The state flexed its muscles on the target least capable of fighting back.
It requires us to hold two deeply conflicting truths at the exact same time. Truth one, the system was deeply biased. The state treated Mary with disproportionate cruelty because she was a powerless immigrant.
But truth two, Mary Mallon was genuinely dangerous. She did break her promise, she did use a fake name, and her actions directly caused suffering and death at that maternity hospital.
She wasn't an innocent martyr, but she wasn't a cartoon villain either. She was a tragedy trapped in the middle of this massive paradigm shift.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because the ultimate irony of this massive human drama, the police raids, the court battles, the newspaper headlines, is that hunting down Mary Mallon did absolutely nothing to stop the actual typhoid epidemic.
Nothing at all. Quarantining carriers was biologically and logistically futile. There were thousands of asymptomatic carriers walking the streets of New York by then. You could never lock them all up.
Right. Going back to our analogy, the city is a ship with a giant hole in the hull, and they spent a decade obsessed with Mary Ellen's teaspoon.
It was a massive distraction from the real issue.
But while the press was completely fixated on the island in the East River, the actual solution to the typhoid epidemic was happening quietly, underground. And it had nothing to do with quarantining cooks. It wasn't doctors hunting people. It was engineers staring at rivers.
Yes, we are shifting now to the infrastructural revolution.
The real conquest.
The men who actually saved the American city realized that if the environment is contaminated, you can't just fix the people. You have to engineer an environment where the disease cannot reach the population in the first place.
The solution wasn't medical at all. It was mechanical and chemical. So let's break down the mechanics of how they built this massive, invisible shield over the city. You don't need to fight the enemy hand-to-hand in the streets if you can stop them from reaching the city walls, right?
Exactly. And it started with municipal sand filtration.
Now, this isn't just dumping water through a kitchen sieve. The scale of these early 1900s filtration plants is just staggering to think about.
They were massive.
Yeah.
Cities built acres and acres of these huge concrete basins, and they filled them with very deep layers of specific, carefully graded gravel and sand.
And the brilliance of this sand filtration lies in a biological phenomenon called the Schmutzdecke, right?
Yes, the Schmutzdecke. It's a German term that translates roughly to dirt cover.
Dirt cover.
When you run river water very slowly through a bed of sand, this sticky gelatinous layer naturally forms on the very top of the sand.
But this layer isn't just physical dirt, is it?
Not at all. It is a thriving, highly active, predatory microbial metropolis.
That is the part that completely blows my mind. The sand isn't just acting like a physical net catching the typhoid bacteria.
No, it's active. The harmless microorganisms living in that sticky top layer, the algae, the protozoa, the benign bacteria, they are actively hunting and consuming the pathogenic Salmo and typhi as the water passes through.
It is basically a biological slaughterhouse for disease.
It's incredible. And it was incredibly effective at reducing bacterial counts in the water supply. But As brilliant as the Schmutz deck was, slow sand filtration required massive amounts of land.
Right, because the water had to move slowly.
Yes, and it required constant, intensive maintenance to keep that microbial layer healthy. So it was a massive leap forward, absolutely, but it wasn't the final definitive blow against typhoid.
That blow came in the form of a chemical revolution.
Enter chlorination.
And to understand how this changed the world, we have to look at a highly controversial, incredibly dramatic moment in 1908 in Jersey City, New Jersey.
Jersey City is the flashpoint for modern water safety. The city was embroiled in this massive, bitter legal battle with a private water company over the quality of the water being drawn from the Boonton Reservoir.
Because the water was frequently contaminated with sewage runoff, right?
Yes, and the city was threatening to completely void the water company's contract.
So the water company is panicking. They hired this extraordinary physician and sanitary expert named Dr. John L. Leal to solve the problem quickly.
And Leal had a deeply personal motivation for this fight, too. His own father had actually died of dysentery, which is another horrific waterborne disease during the Civil War.
So he had skin in the game. And Leal knew that building a slow sand filtration plant would just be too slow and way too expensive to build in time to save the contract.
Right. So he teamed up with an engineer named George Warren Fuller, and together they proposed something that sounded absolutely insane to the general public at the time.
What did they do?
They proposed continuously adding a precisely calculated drip of calcium hypochlorite, which is essentially bleaching powder, directly into the municipal water supply before it reached the city's pipes.
I really want to emphasize how radical this was to people back then. I mean, you are basically telling a terrified public, yes, your water is full of invisible deadly germs. To fix it, we are going to build a chemical plant and pour an invisible toxic chemical disinfectant into your drinking water. And trust us, it's going to save you.
People thought Leal was trying to poison the entire city.
Of course they did. It sounds like madness.
But Leal understood the chemistry perfectly. Chlorine acts as a highly reactive oxidizing agent. When it encounters a bacterium like Salmonella typhi, it doesn't just poison it in a traditional sense. It physically destroys it.
Like a microscopic wrecking ball.
Exactly. The chlorine molecules strip the electrons away from the lipids in the bacterial cell wall. The cell wall literally ruptures, the chlorine scrambles the internal enzymes, and the bacteria simply disintegrate.
It's literal chemical warfare on a microscopic scale. So Leal and Fuller set up this chlorination plant, essentially in secret, right?
They did. They ran it for a few months to gather hard data to prove it worked, and then they presented the results in court.
And the data was undeniable. The bacteria were absolutely obliterated. Jersey City became the very first city in the United States to pioneer large-scale continuous chlorination of a municipal water supply.
And the results of combining sand filtration with chemical chlorination across other American cities over the next few years produced some of the most dramatic data sets in the history of public health.
We are not talking about a gradual multi-decade decline here.
No, we're talking about mortality rates falling completely off a cliff.
The data reveals that filtration and chlorination together slashed typhoid deaths by roughly 90% within just a few years in treated cities. 90%. It was an instant, overwhelming victory.
To really quantify this, we look to the landmark research of economists David Cutler and Grant Miller. Their analysis actually isolated the impact of clean water technologies from other medical advancements of the era.
And what did they find?
They concluded that the introduction of municipal water filtration and chlorination was responsible for nearly half, about 43%, of the total massive decline in overall urban mortality in the United States between 1900 and 1940.
Wait, half? Half of the entire decline in urban death rates was just because of clean water?
Yes. Half of all the lives saved in that entire 40-year era can be traced directly back to the pipes and the chemicals. It was a municipal victory, driven entirely by local water departments.
That is a staggering metric. It proves that the true heroes of human longevity in the 20th century weren't, doctors at bedsides writing prescriptions. They were civil engineers pouring concrete and calibrating chemical drips.
It's a huge paradigm shift in how we think about medicine.
But there's a massive catch to this engineering triumph, isn't there? I mean, if you lived in an affluent, organized metropolis like Jersey City or New York that had the capital to build these systems, you survived. But what if you lived in a smaller town or a city whose political leaders simply refused to spend the money?
Then you had a deadly patchwork of safety. The biological reality of typhoid hadn't changed one bit only the local infrastructure had.
So if you traveled from a safe, chlorinated city to a town without a plant, you could literally drink a glass of water at a diner and die a month later.
Exactly. The engineers proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that clean water was possible, but engineering alone couldn't force a stubborn local mayor to actually build a plant.
Right. For this localized municipal success to protect the entire country, it needed a unifying rule. Someone had to legally define exactly what clean actually meant and force everyone to adhere to it.
And this brings us to the crucial role of the federal government, specifically the U.S. Public Health Service, or the PHS.
The intervention of the Public Health Service in 1914 is just a masterclass in the strategic application of structural regulatory power.
It really is. In 1914, the PHS issued the very first federal drinking water standards. They published strict, laboratory-defined bacteriological limits. They quantified safety, declaring exactly how many microscopic bacteria were permissible in a sample before it was legally deemed lethal.
But when you look closely at the scope of these 1914 standards, there is a fascinating, almost bizarre constitutional limitation. The federal government did not actually have the authority to just decree every city in America must chlorinate its water.
Right, because of the 10th Amendment. It reserves police powers, including local health and safety regulations, to the individual states. The feds couldn't just march into a town and commandeer the local waterworks.
So they found a brilliantly clever legal loophole. They used the Interstate Commerce Clause.
Exactly. The Constitution gives the federal government the power to regulate commerce that crosses state lines. Therefore, the 1914 bacteriological standards were initially drafted to apply only to the drinking water served aboard interstate trains and passenger ships.
Okay, wait, so what does this all mean for the average person? If the federal government was only testing the water cooler on a train car, how on earth did that solve the typhoid crisis for people living in houses?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's all about the ripple effect. Think about the logistics of a steam locomotive in 1914. A train traveling from Philadelphia to Chicago doesn't carry all its water from the start.
It would be too heavy.
Right. It has to stop at municipal train stations along the route to refill its drinking water tanks from the local town supply.
Ah, I see.
Once the PHS mandated that trains could only serve water meeting the new strict federal standard, the railroad companies were suddenly legally liable for the water they served.
So the railroad company executive basically goes to the mayor of the small town and says, look, our train brings thousands of dollars of commerce into your town every week, but the federal government says your water is toxic. If you don't build a chlorination plant to clean your water up to the federal standard, our trains will simply stop stopping here.
It utilized immense economic leverage to force local public health improvements without technically violating state sovereignty.
That is brilliant.
But the impact of the 1914 standards went far beyond just towns with railway stops. The true structural regulatory power of the PHS action was that they created the golden national template.
Because before 1914, clean water was basically a subjective opinion. After 1914, it was an objective scientific metric.
It's exactly. State health boards and city councils looked at that federal document and realized they finally had a roadmap. Even if they weren't legally forced by a train route, they voluntarily adopted the PHS standards because failing to meet them was a public admission of incompetence.
It was structural power at its absolute finest. The federal government didn't dig a single trench or lay a single pipe, but by setting the baseline rule, they triggered a nationwide avalanche of infrastructure.
And that standard wasn't static. We can trace how these 1914 standards evolved over the decades. As industrialization introduced new threats, the standards expanded from just measuring bacteria to regulating heavy metals, chemical runoff, and even radiation.
This unbroken lineage of federal oversight eventually culminates in the landmark Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974.
Which finally granted the Environmental Protection Agency the comprehensive authority to regulate all public water systems nationwide.
The DNA of the water testing happening in every modern American city today was essentially written by those PHS officers testing train cars in 1914.
It's a direct lineage.
And that brings us to the core realization of how public health actually saves lives on a massive scale. We conquered one of the most terrifying diseases in human history, but we didn't do it with medicine.
We must be precise about the medical history here, though. A listener familiar with medical history might point out a potential counterargument: the typhoid vaccine.
Right, there was a vaccine.
There was. An immunologist named Almroth Wright developed an effective typhoid vaccine in Britain in the late 1890s.
And it's true, the vaccine was highly utilized by the military. The U.S. Army mandated it for soldiers around 1911, and it absolutely saved thousands of troops from tough and crowded camps. But if there was a vaccine, why did the engineers and the regulators get the credit for saving the cities?
Because of the vast difference between a controlled military population and a chaotic civilian society. In the military, you can line up every single soldier and mandate an injection under threat of court-martial.
But in the sprawling, exploding cities of civilian America, running a mandatory universal vaccination campaign was logistically impossible and politically unthinkable.
The civilian reality was very different. The data proves it. The massive 90% drops in typhoid mortality in American cities happened before any widespread civilian use of the vaccine.
The victory over the epidemic in the civilian world was not achieved through an individual cure. It was purely an infrastructural and regulatory victory.
We really must use the word preventative here. It marked a monumental shift in the philosophy of public health. It moved the discipline away from a reactionary model, waiting for a person to get sick and then trying to treat them, to a prevented model.
They stopped trying to heal the infected and started engineering an environment where the infection couldn't exist in the first place. Preventive structural power.
And when you look back at the two paths we've walked today, the contrast between those two philosophies of power is haunting.
It really is. I mean, let's synthesize the emotional and historical weight of what we've covered. On one hand, you have the miraculous, quiet, template-setting power of the PHS and municipal engineers. That invisible structural power saved hundreds of thousands of lives and drove typhoid to near eradication in the United States by around 1936.
And on the other hand, you have the dark counterpoint, the tragic, coercive failure of how the state treated Mary Mallon.
That is the shadow hanging over this entire victory. The system's attempt to exercise direct, coercive power over one marginalized individual, a powerless immigrant cook, ruined her life. They dragged her from her home, locked her on an island for 26 years, stripped her of her basic human rights.
And the bitter irony is that destroying her life barely moved the needle on the disease.
Coercion failed. Blaming the individual failed. But cleaning the environment succeeded.
It is the defining lesson of the era. Public health authorities can act as a police force, hunting down individual vectors, or they can act as architects, building a safer ecosystem for everyone. The history of clean water proves that the architect is infinitely more effective than the policeman.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you thinking about the invisible systems you rely on every day.
Right. Consider the invisible public health infrastructures you interact with today. The air filtration systems humming quietly in the ceiling of your office, silently scrubbing pathogens from the air. Consider the miles of subterranean pipes delivering that flawless municipal water to your tap.
It's all around us.
If the greatest, most absolute public health victories of the past century required massive, invisible environmental engineering, rather than individual medical treatments or punitive quarantines, it raises a vital question for us today. What modern crises are we currently trying to fight by policing and blaming individual people, when we should really be focusing all our energy on building better pipes?
Are we still hunting cooks when we should be building filters? It completely changes how you view the structures of your city. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the conquest of typhoid, the tragic history of Mary Mallon, and the ultimate triumph of the engineers. The next time you turn on the tap, take a second to look at the water before you drink it. You are holding the result of one of the greatest, most hard-fought, and most invisible public health victories in human history.